What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a list of 5 games that surpassed my expectations and honestly just really kind of blew me away. As someone who reviews a lot of games, I try not to let my biases get in the way right before I even start a title, but nonetheless, you hear a lot of things from marketing and just word of mouth, honestly, about what a game is supposed to be, so after a while you kind of get the, I kind of know what this is going into it feeling. Well, these particular games were, simply put, much better than I expected. Now, I'm going to avoid spoiling too much of any of these, obviously, so you don't really need to worry about spoilers or anything like that for these titles. Outside of stuff you learn very early in the games, that type of thing. General plot setups, if you will. Now, first up on our list is the game that kind of inspired this video, actually, and that is Expeditions Rome. If you're unfamiliar, the Expeditions series, which is comprised of Conquistador, Viking, and now Rome, which it's quite possible will be the last, but we'll get into that in just a second. This series was a sort of tactics-based system in which you'd kind of explore historical events with some sort of loose interpretation. Obviously, it was not directly historical, but in Rome specifically, you're sort of a stand-in for Julius Caesar. However, it is not what anyone would consider historically accurate, but a lot of the events that played out in Julius Caesar's life are things you can sort of deal with and recreate. Now, what surprised me and really blew me away about this game was that I went into it thinking it was going to just be a TRPG, or a tactical turn-based RPG, and what I actually got out of it was a full-blown CRPG that was really well done. There's a great amount of options. You can make several decisions that change the game quite a bit. There are multiple endings depending on multiple factors. The battles themselves are very good. And overall, Expeditions Rome was just a game that every time I turned around, it was surprising me with how much more there were to the mechanics and the choices and the playstyles. And considering that, again, I just went into it expecting a more run-of-the-mill TRPG experience, I was thoroughly blown away. Now, unfortunately, Expeditions Rome is very likely to be the last, or potentially last, Expeditions series game that we get, because while I don't have the exact specifics, the studio kind of like fell apart after the release, where like half the team went to work on some NFT project, and I'm pretty sure everybody sees how well NFTs are doing these days, so I don't have high hopes for them in that regard, but hard to say what the studio will do next, as I don't believe they've actually gone under or anything like that. But nonetheless, that brings us to our number 2 spot, and that is none other than Ruined King. This is actually a League of Legends sort of JRPG experience, which is a bit outside of the games that I normally cover on this channel, but it released right when Riot was doing just all sorts of extra stuff for League of Legends outside of, obviously, League of Legends, but rather expanding their Runeterra universe with things like that Netflix series that came out, and another game actually, which was less interesting to me. But they sent me a copy of this thing, and I figured I'd check it out, and I fully admit that my expectations going into it were that it was going to be a sort of spin-off thing that was probably, because it was being a spin-off type of thing, not going to be very good. And actually, I thought it was very good, kind of the complete opposite. If anything, it reminded me of a lot of the Final Fantasy games. They have a bit of a unique battle mechanic that incorporates the lane system, or, lanes anyway, from League of Legends, obviously not the exact same system, but you can kind of mess around with that lane system to affect your combat abilities, which then affects the pacing of combat. And there's all sorts of secret stuff and extra stuff to discover, along with a story that is pretty decent. So I think much like the other Riot properties that year, actually kind of just really blew everybody away with how much better it was than really anybody was expecting. And while I don't believe there's anything scheduled for a while, it does have me kind of paying attention to what games Riot will be releasing via Riot Forge, their sort of third-party publisher that's dealing with all of the non-League of Legends Runeterra games. But we'll see what else they get up to, because I thought Ruined King was much better than I was expecting, especially with it being essentially a spin-off. Third on our list, we have Shadowrun Dragonfall. Now, when you think about all those games that got Kickstarter funding that kind of reinvigorated CRPGs in the early 2010s, Shadowrun is among them, though it is typically speaking not as widely regarded as one of those games, just generally. when people think of that, they don't really think of Shadowrun that much. However, nonetheless, Shadowrun was right in there with that group, and Shadowrun Dragonfall is the second in what they released as a trilogy. And Shadowrun Returns, the first one, acted as more of a proof of concept kind of tech demo than anything else. Like, technically it's a game, but it was very limited in scope. And then the next title, Shadowrun Dragonfall, is again just a full-blown CRPG. And while it doesn't do everything perfectly, I loved what they did with the companions, as the companions in Dragonfall are just very, very well done. I think I didn't like maybe one of them, which is probably Blitz. But beyond that, the writing and the story, while in some cases not the most original of stuff, is nonetheless really well done. It has some very cool moments, and outside of some frustrating combat missions, I actually think it is a must-play for CRPG enthusiasts because, again, if you just played Shadowrun Returns, you would never guess how much Shadowrun Dragonfall improved from that original game. And if nothing else, I really do think people should experience some of the companion stories that come with Dragonfall, and the studio, Harebrained Schemes, should really be proud of that particular game. But nonetheless, moving on to number 4, with the one that I think people might argue with me about the most, and that is none other than Elex. Elex is far from a perfect game. Now, truth be told, I was a little disappointed with the second entry, which released earlier this year, as it was a bit too copy-paste, but the original Elex really pulled me in. Now, this was a game people had been requesting me to play, and I had never messed with it before. However, I had heard that it had some real clunkiness to the combat and just a variety of things that made it more difficult to play than it really should be. And while in many ways I would agree with those statements, the actual RPG elements of Elex really did pull me in. And I got very invested into my character and building them up and adjusting their stats and actually training them up. And then, of course, their relationships with the companions. And, of course, having to make some actual choices that had consequences, all while fighting these absolute monstrosities with, honestly, a really interesting story that was going on in the background that, again, I think Elex 2 kind of flubbed a little bit. But when I went into Elex, I had been expecting it to be a bit of a clunky grind to play through, but probably 10 hours into Elex, I was just hooked. I couldn't put that game down. I played it so much until I had done all of the things. Now, that said, Elex isn't a game for everybody, and I wouldn't necessarily take this as a recommendation. I'm just saying that Elex was a lot better than I thought it was going to be, and I enjoyed it a great deal. But that, of course, brings us to number 5 on our list, and this one is a favorite of mine, and it is actually Divine Divinity. Now, if you know anything about the channel at all, I used to cover Divinity a lot. I've told this story many times, so I'll keep it brief. The first Divinity game I ever played was Original Sin 2, but I loved that game so much, I was just like, I need to know everything about the Divinity series. However, the first game, Divine Divinity, is very old. It's from I think 2002, if my memory serves, and it is actually a sort of open world Diablo-like. However, instead of being an ARPG completely, it still gives you character building and choice and consequence, and there's all this exploration, because again, it's an open world, which is actually really strange. And when I jumped into the title with it being that old, I wasn't expecting a game of that age, and then the type of game it was, essentially an indie game from an unknown developer at the time, to just blow me away like that. In fact, if you ever played Divine Divinity, I think you'll be genuinely shocked about how many things they tried to do with it and did successfully. Now, the reason you still can't really recommend Divine Divinity to people, if you will, is that it is very clunky in its old age. There's no real UI scaling. It's not a fan of modern hardware at all, so honestly, just getting it to run can be a hassle. But if you can put up with that, and potentially game-breaking bugs, by the way, that you can typically fix with a hex editor, but still, you can have a genuinely amazing experience for a very small amount of money with a game that I think is better than it had any right to be, and it is honestly not surprising to me, after having played Divine Divinity, that the Divinity series went on to be what it became. Because while the story between Divine Divinity and Divinity Original Sin 2 is very vast, you could tell just by playing Divine Divinity that they had a gold mine on their hands. But that, guys, is going to do it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think of it down in the comment section below, or if you have any games that surprised you and were much better than you expected, I'd love to hear all about them. Regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.